Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and this is from my perspective this week as we go into week 5. I just wanted to share some things with you that maybe either they're off the beaten path and you don't get exposed to them, or maybe you read through them rather hurriedly and miss some of the salient points. We're talking about a very interesting period of American history, this time right before and during the American Revolution and what was going on in the country. We tend to have a romanticized view of that period of our founding fathers, and that still goes on today very much in our history and our politics. That we have a certain view that our founding fathers were thus and so, and so we just assume that to be the case and rightly examine the details. And so I want to be sure that you get the details. One of the interesting things about our discussions this week, and they were really good. I sent you in the daily brief a note about the richness of what you're writing about and thinking about, and you're doing a really good job with that. I hope you will go back and read not only the responses of your classmates, but to read my responses to them as well, because many times they will pick up on something that we haven't talked about, and I'll add to that in the discussion, and others will do the same. So it's very important that you get the full effect of the discussion. This is probably the best part of what we do in this class is the discussion boards, because this is our time in class to talk to each other, communicate, and contribute. One of the things that was interesting this week that I wanted to mention to you is to be sure that we don't just lock into one side and miss the other perspective. There are always two sides, as your grandmother probably told you, there's two sides to every question. And it's so easy for us just to mark off the British as being tax hungry, or want to raise money and not caring. And some of that was true. I'm not discounting that, but you also miss a big part of the story if you don't delve a bit deeper into the French and Indian War as a part of a wider world war, the 30 Years War that's been going on in Europe for quite a while. And so it literally moved to all the areas where the British and the French had colonial empires. And so it finally comes to America. When it finally gets here in the French and Indian War, there are things that are very, very definitely true. Number one, both countries are saddled with a huge financial debt. And they're trying to find ways to raise money to win this war and to defeat each other. The British and the French hate each other. They still do. They haven't changed very much in that over the centuries, but they enlist their Native American allies to help them almost as additional soldiers, and they will hire soldiers. Even in the Revolution, the British will hire the Hessians, and this uh, creates shock and awe. It creates fear in the hearts of the colonials, because the Hessians were known as the mercenaries who took no prisoners, gave no quarter. They slaughtered and killed everyone and left no survivors. And just for the notice that the Hessians are joining the battle on the side of the British must have caused some fear in the hearts of the American colonials. But they had to enlist other help, and the Native Americans, in exchange for goods and things that they were giving them in trade, joined in on both sides and helped in the revolution, which further exacerbated the colonials, who also lived in fear of Native American reprisals and attacks and all the things that went along with that, because the Native Americans could be quite brutal in their frustrations, taken out on settlers. So there is a side to that. The other thing that I mentioned in the writing is the Declaration of Independence. There are two sides to that story. We live in awe of that document, and we should. It's one of the great founding documents in history. But we fail to realize that that document was sent as a letter to the British. And a few years ago, the British literally found the original Declaration of Independence they had gotten in the mail back in 1774, 75. And we were all agog. Oh, this is our document. This is wonderful. This is precious. And to the Brits, it was just a letter from some rebels trying to leave the country. So you see, there's two perspectives of that. The tax perspective, of course, is of major importance, and it will agitate and drive us to war fairly quickly. The other thing you have to realize, and I keep hitting on these points because repetition, number one, aids learning, and number two, you might miss it in the fray, and that is that the British operated under what was called mercantilism. Their empire, the sole design and reason for having a world empire was to get raw materials to funnel the first industrial revolution that was just starting in England, especially. And so we were here, the colonies were here for the purpose of supplying raw materials. If you go back and read the minutes of ship captains in the early days from Columbus forward, they mentioned the number of trees here. And of course, we've made the statement before, wood was at a tremendous premium in England, especially they were burning animal dung to keep warm. And shipbuilding was almost crippled because they could not find the wood to build ships. And so this is going to, the colonies are going to spur the shipbuilding industry. And we're going to be sending trees there for mast and lumber and all these other things. But we're not building much of it here because we're not allowed to have industries here to build things. We are certainly here to supply and let England build it, and then we buy it back from them so that in effect was mercantilism at its best. And so this kept the colonists kind of tapped down, and also it increased the black market trade. And this was another concern of England, that their colonies were buying things from other countries and other peoples on the black market rather than buying it from England, where it was much more expensive. This would have been true of rum and other things from the West Indies. And so there is this battle to keep us from actually purchasing goods. And this is going to be a problem in the revolution because we are going to need armament and we're going to need weapons. And we don't have much weapons. When the war starts, people are fighting with their squirrel guns and their rakes and their hoes. They don't have weapons like the British, and they can't go out into the field and put an army together like the British do. And the British are angered by that the colonials won't fight fairly, which is basically you take an army, you two armies out into the field, they're in a square box formation. They shoot, first side takes a round, a volley, and those men fall, and then the second side takes the volley, and they shoot out back at each other until finally nobody's standing. And whoever didn't have anybody standing is the loser. The colonials are going to have to fight behind walls and trees and skirmishes and attacks and picking the British off and all those kind of things. That's what happened at Lexington and Concord, which actually started the war. So these things are aspects that I don't want you to miss in the discussion, is that there are two sides to every argument and there are two sides to the war. We can't just get enamored as historians with the American story, and it's great in itself. To understand the American story, you must also understand the British side. So please take some time to kind of think through and put yourself in their place. And there are people on both sides in the colonies. Everybody in the colonies are not pro-revolution. In fact, I've said this repeatedly, that the revolution was basically started by the elites of the society, the wealthy men. And they had to sell the war to the rank and file, which is what Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense basically helped to do, was to justify taking up arms against a sovereign. And this was a huge act because it involved their religion. They were God's children and God's people, and God had ordained the king to be their ruler. And it took quite a bit of umph to, if you will, to rise up against the God-ordained ruler. And you had to justify that mentally and think through those things. Luckily, the rights issue had been thought about for about 300 years, but nobody had ever done what America would do, what the colonists would do. And as I've said repeatedly, that's why it was called the Great Experiment. No one expected it to survive. No one expected it to last. And we still ask those questions. Are we going to survive? Are we going to last? So there's a lot of things to be considered in looking at this. And this is such rich material, and your discussions make it much more so, because I want you to expand your horizons, be a little critical of what you read, ask questions, and then let's discuss and hash out the answers. And I think you will be the better student for it. And learning in your writing to show, at least give a nod to both sides of an issue when you write. You don't have to write 50 pages on each side, but you do have to admit in your writing that there is another side. I think that's very helpful. It's also part of critical thinking, that you understand there's always two sides of this. So this has been kind of helpful to you as a historian, as a writer. These things are things that I consider every day in my writing, and I hope you will in yours. Many of you are history majors, and so that makes this kind of discussion all the more important. You need to kind of sit around with people that do history and understand and think about the parameters of what you're going to be doing in the future. And I hope many of you will go on to graduate school, at least get your master's in history, and teach one day, because that is one of the great treasures of my life, is to be able to share this time with you. And I do look forward to our live chats soon. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to hit me up, send me an email, give me a call, and we can chat about anything that you find to be quite interesting in this part of the study. So until next time, thank you. This has been From My Perspective.